For 72 hours, Keanu Reeves completely disappeared, and nobody in Hollywood knew where he had gone. But what he discovered during those 3 days would force him to question everything he thought he knew about fame, success, and what it means to truly live. It started with a mistake, a wrong turn on a mountain road in Northern California that should have taken him back to his hotel. Instead, it led him to a place that didn't appear on any GPS, a small town where nobody recognized him, nobody asked for selfies, and nobody cared that he was one of the most famous actors in the world. The town was called Cedar Falls, population 847, according to a weathered sign that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Keanu's motorcycle had broken down just outside the town limits, leaving him stranded with nothing but a backpack, his leather jacket, and the uncomfortable realization that his phone had no signal. What happened next would change his perspective on life forever. But before we reveal what Keanu discovered in Cedar Falls, we need to understand what drove him to that mountain road in the first place. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a movie role. It was something much more personal, something that had been eating away at him for months. 3 weeks earlier, Keanu had been sitting in his agent's office, listening to a presentation about his next 5 years in Hollywood. Charts and graphs showed his box office appeal, demographic reach, and projected earnings through 2030. His agent spoke about him like he was a brand, a product to be managed and maximized. The key is consistency, his agent had said, pointing to a color-coded calendar. We keep you visible, keep the projects coming, maintain the mystique. The public loves Keanu Reeves, the icon. We just need to make sure Keanu Reeves, the person, doesn't interfere with that. Something about that phrase, doesn't interfere with that, had stuck with him like a splinter. When had he become separate from his own identity? When had Keanu Reeves, the person, become a liability to Keanu Reeves, the brand? That night, he had walked through his house in the Hollywood Hills, looking at the expensive furniture, the award nominations on his walls, the carefully curated art collection that his interior designer had selected. None of it felt like. It felt like a museum dedicated to someone he used to be, or maybe someone he was supposed to be. So he'd gotten on his motorcycle and started driving north, with no destination in mind except away from the meetings, the schedules, the careful management of his public image, away from the life that everyone else seemed to think he should want. The breakdown in Cedar Falls hadn't been planned, but maybe it had been inevitable. Maybe he'd needed something to force him to stop running and start looking at what he was running from. The mechanic who'd towed his bike was a gruff man in his 60s named Frank, who'd looked at the expensive motorcycle and then at Keanu with undisguised skepticism. Parts won't be here until Monday, Frank had said matter-of-factly. You got somewhere to stay? That was Friday afternoon. By Sunday evening, Keanu would understand why some people never leave small towns and why others spend their whole lives trying to get back to them. But first, he had to figure out how to be nobody in a place where being somebody had never mattered in the first place. The only hotel in Cedar Falls was a modest 2-story building called the Pine Inn, run by a woman named Dorothy, who seemed genuinely unaware that she was checking in one of Hollywood's biggest stars. She handed him a real key, not a key card, but an actual brass key attached to a plastic pine tree. Room 12, she said cheerfully. Continental breakfast starts at 7. Coffee's always fresh in the lobby if you need it earlier. Keanu climbed the narrow stairs to his room, expecting to find the kind of generic hotel space he'd grown accustomed to during location shoots. Instead, he found something that felt like a real person's guest bedroom. Handmade quilts on the bed, family photos on the dresser, books on the nightstand that showed actual wear from being read. He picked up one of the books, a collection of short stories by local authors, and found a note tucked inside. For our guests who appreciate good stories and quiet nights, enjoy your stay. Dorothy. When was the last time someone had given him something without wanting something in return? That evening, with nothing to do and nowhere to be, Keanu wandered into the town's only restaurant, a place called Maggie's that looked like it had been serving the same menu since 1975. The waitress, a woman about his age with kind eyes and flour on her apron, seated him at a corner table without a second glance. First time in Cedar Falls? She asked, filling his water glass. Yeah, Keanu said, waiting for the inevitable recognition, the change in tone that always followed. But it didn't come. Instead, she just smiled and said, well, you picked a good weekend for it. Weather's supposed to be beautiful tomorrow. You here for the hiking? The conversation that followed was unlike any Keanu had experienced in years. The waitress, Maggie, as it turned out, talked to him like a normal person. She recommended trails, warned him about which paths got muddy after rain, told him about the best spot to watch the sunrise over the valley. She didn't ask what he did for work. She didn't seem to care where he was from or where he was going. She treated him like what he was in that moment, a stranger passing through who might appreciate some local knowledge and a good meal. But what happened the next morning would prove even more transformative. Unable to sleep past dawn, a habit formed by decades of early call times, Keanu decided to take Maggie's advice about the sunrise spot. The trail was easy to find, marked by worn wooden signs that felt more like friendly suggestions than official markers. The hike took him through old-growth forest that filtered the morning light into cathedral-like beams. The air smelled like pine and earth and possibilities. When he reached the overlook, he found he wasn't alone. An elderly man sat on a bench that faced the valley, a thermos of coffee steaming beside. He nodded as Keanu approached, a gesture that managed to be both welcoming and undemanding. "Beautiful morning," the man said. "Yeah," Keanu agreed, sitting on the opposite end of the bench. "It really is." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and green. Finally, the man spoke again. "You seem like someone with something on your mind." Keanu glanced over, surprised by the directness. The man looked to be in his 70s, with weathered hands and eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom. "I guess I am," Keanu admitted. "Want to talk about it? Sometimes it helps to tell a stranger." For reasons he couldn't fully explain, Keanu found himself opening up to this man, whose name he didn't even know. He talked about feeling lost despite being successful, about the difference between being known and being understood, about the strange isolation that comes with fame. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," he concluded. "Like the real me got left behind somewhere, and now I don't know how to find him again." The old man listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When Keanu finished, they sat in silence again, while the sun completed its climb above the mountains. Finally, the man spoke. "You know what I think your problem is?" Keanu waited. "You've been trying so hard to be what everyone else wants you to be that you forgot who you were before anyone was watching." The words hit Keanu like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. "My name's Henry," the man continued. "I've lived in this valley for 73 years, raised 5 kids here, buried my wife here, watched my grandchildren take their first steps on these trails." He poured coffee from his thermos into a spare cup and handed it to Keanu. "You know what I learned in all that time? The happiest people aren't the ones who have the most or achieve the most. They're the ones who know who they are and aren't afraid to be that person, even when nobody's looking." Keanu sipped the coffee, bitter and strong and somehow perfect for the moment. "But how do you figure out who you are when you've been performing for so long?" he asked. Henry smiled. "You start small. You help someone who can't help you back. You do something kind without anyone knowing about it. You remember what used to make you happy before happiness became your job." That afternoon, Keanu found himself volunteering at the town's community garden, helping Henry and a small group of retirees plant vegetables for the local food bank. His hands, more accustomed to holding props and signing autographs, learned the rhythm of digging and planting and watering. Nobody asked him about movies or motorcycles or his personal life. They talked about soil pH and pest control, and whether the tomatoes would be ready before the first frost. For the first time in years, Keanu felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with entertainment value. As the day wore on, he found himself really laughing, at Henry's stories about his grandchildren's attempts at gardening. He felt muscles in his face that had grown stiff from years of careful, camera-ready smile. That evening, back at Maggie's restaurant, he noticed things he'd missed the night before. The way Maggie remembered every regular customer's usual order. The way she checked on the elderly couple in the corner booth, making sure they had everything they needed. The way she moved through her work with a kind of graceful purpose that spoke of someone who had found their place in the world. After closing time, Keanu found himself helping Maggie stack chairs and wipe down tables, a task that felt both foreign and familiar. They worked in comfortable silence, 2 people sharing the simple satisfaction of honest work. "You seem different tonight," Maggie observed as they finished up. "Different how?" "More here," she said simply. "Yesterday you seemed like you were thinking about somewhere else. Tonight you seem like you're actually in Cedar Falls, walking back to the Pine Inn under a sky blazing with stars. More stars than he'd ever seen from his house in the hills." Keanu realized that Maggie was right. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing, wasn't managing his image, wasn't trying to be anyone other than exactly who he was in that moment. But Sunday brought the reality of Frank's phone call. The parts had arrived early, and his motorcycle would be ready by afternoon. As Keanu packed his few belongings that morning, he faced a choice that would define not just his weekend, but potentially the rest of his life. Standing in room 12 of the Pine Inn, Keanu stared at his packed bag and realized he didn't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The thought terrified him. He'd built his entire adult life around movement, from one role to the next, one city to the next, one version of himself to the next. The idea of staying in one place, of being consistently himself rather than whoever the moment required him to be, felt both impossible and necessary. His phone, which had remained silent for 3 days, suddenly buzzed with a flood of messages as it found a signal near the window. But instead of responding immediately, Keanu found himself walking downstairs to find Dorothy at the front desk. "Would it be possible to extend my stay?" he asked. Dorothy smiled, the same warm, uncomplicated smile she'd given him when he'd first arrived. "Of course, dear. How much longer were you thinking?" "I'm not sure yet," Keanu admitted. "Maybe a week, maybe longer." "Room 12 is yours as long as you need it," she said, as if famous actors asking for indefinite extension was the most normal thing in the world. That afternoon, instead of riding south toward Los Angeles, Keanu called his agent from Frank's garage. "I need to take some time," he said, watching Frank carefully reassemble his motorcycle engine with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. "Time for what?" his agent asked, panic creeping into his voice. "We have meetings scheduled. Projects to discuss. Time to remember who I am," Keanu interrupted gently. "And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is stop running and start remembering what it feels like to simply exist, without explanation or performance or apology." In Cedar Falls, Keanu had learned that the opposite of fame isn't obscurity, it's authenticity, and that was worth more than all the box office numbers in the world.